Welcome to Business of Being Black with Tammi Mac. I'm Tammi Mac. Hello, everybody. So the art of comedy has always found a way to push societal issues to new limits. But sometimes those limits are pushed too far and become less of a laughing matter. Comedian Dave Chappelle and his recent Netflix comedy special, The Closer, has been condemned by many marginalized groups for not only being offensive, but also damaging. Well, the business of being Black right now is comedy. Is it necessary to censor the art? Please welcome award-winning comedian Samson McCormick. Hi, Samson.
Hey, Tammy.
Comedian and personality Teron Von Gossary. Hi, Teron.
Hi, Tammy. I love you.
Love you right back. And also, let's not leave out educator and culture critic, Dr. Jonathan Paul Higgins. Hi, Dr. Paul.
Hi, thanks for having me.
Listen, I always ask, my first question never changes. It's why should Black people care? Why should Black people care about comedy at all when it comes to the culture, when it comes to being offensive, and when it comes to pushing the borderlines of bullying? Why should Black people care, Samson?
Black people should care about comedy because comedy for Black people has been a way of life. When we haven't been able to express ourselves in any other way, we have been able to sit down and drink that gin or drink that yak or whatever else we're drinking on or smoking on. You know how we do. And use comedy to deal with our reality. Comedy has always been a very important part of life for the Black community.
Teron, why should Black people care?
Comedy is our culture. Comedy is a part of who we are. And most importantly, because cancel culture affects Black comedians the most and comedians of color. They go after us first. Whenever you go after anyone, it's always us.
Really? The good doctor. Why should Black people care about comedy being offensive?
Well, you know, my mom always used to tell me when I was a kid that if they'll come for me in the morning, they will come for you in the night. And I genuinely believe that when we're talking about comedy and we're talking about the culture of quote unquote speaking truth to power or using it as a way for us to feel better about what we're going through, it really is about zoning out and looking at the larger conversation around the ways that comedy is not only used to heal us, but ultimately too, how it's been so pivotal and important in our storytelling and navigating the experiences that we have had or have had to learn to laugh at as a culture. So I think comedy is important because it's not only storytelling, but it's also about providing a narrative around a lot of the stories we honestly have not gotten to tell throughout history.
But Samson, is this a cop-out when we say comedy is what gets us through? Is that sort of a cop-out when you say, hey, we're laughing at ourselves? Are we really laughing at ourselves on the outside to mask the hurt that's in the inside? And is that a good thing?
Well, I really reject the sole fact that people believe that comedy can only come from a place of brokenness or pain. I think that, of course, you can use it as a healing balm, but I think it also is a very effective way to tell the truth. And I think the reason why so many more people now are afraid or are not able to handle comedy is because as a society, we have grown afraid of the truth and don't know how to deal with it.
Oh, you just stepped on some toes. Teron, but comedy, I guess you could say it's exaggerated. So is it really the truth when you're telling the jokes? Or is it an exaggerated truth? And how does that differ from a lie?
That's the concept of comedy. Through exaggeration and through its absurdity, you get to the truth. And that's a very fine distinction we must all understand. When you look at life in a close-up, in a zoom lens, it's a tragedy. But when you look at it from a long lens, that's when it becomes comedy. And whether comedy comes from pain or pleasure, either way, comedy cometh.
Comedy cometh. Okay, I got you. Does censorship ruin the authenticity of comedy, Dr. Jonathan?
So I've been going back and forth with this concept around censorship, and I've landed on this idea that, we wouldn't tell a joke about somebody's mother's cancer. We wouldn't tell a joke about somebody dying, I mean, tragically, right? Like we laugh. So this is the thing that I think that, I struggle with in terms of censorship when we're looking at the conversation around someone's comedy is pushing a rhetoric that is killing someone, right? Like trans Black women have been killed more in the last 3 years than anyone else, right? So when we get to the root of this idea that we're censoring someone, no, it's not about censorship. It's about us ultimately saying we are not going to stand for you creating more rhetoric around trans or LGBTQ people that has already led to us dying. So I struggle with this idea that, it's censorship. No, we're ultimately saying if you have to stomp on someone to get a joke in this day and age, in 2002, that might have worked. But in 2021, when we know what transphobia is, when we know what homophobia looks like, we know how they're working, as a system, all oppression is connected. If you have to laugh at me and what I'm going through as a marginalized person, it says more about you and your character and the job that you have as a comedian and less about me as a queer person. So that's just kind of where I stand with that.
Red Fox had a joke on Sanford and Son where he was in the courthouse, and I guess there was someone in the courthouse who said, I don't know, cancer kills more Black people than anything else. And, Fred Sanford said, oh, I thought that was the cops. And that is a joke. But it also, it's a joke that talks about Black people being killed by the police. Right. So how do you rectify that joke and resolve it in terms of the transphobia world? Because there are a ton of cop killing jokes out here, and cops are killing Black people. So how does that balance out with what you just talked about in terms of transphobia or transgender women being killed? It seems like the same concept to me.
So I guess if I'm going to take this conversation, I struggle with this idea that we are going to align a joke about cops killing Black people with the same conversation around someone saying, I don't believe that trans women are women, right? Dave Chappelle said up front that he was a TERF. That period. And I think so this is something I've also been ruminating with, right? I guess with this idea about Fred Sanford and what he's talking about, right? He's, in my mind, using his creative platform to speak truth to power. This is a fact that this is happening, right? However, when you tell someone that you don't believe that trans women are women, what you are doing is you are greenlighting other people to start treating trans women in this idea that they are not women too. So I personally don't think we can align this conversation around someone saying, I'm going to use my comedy to speak truth to power with this idea that Dave Chappelle is now using his platform to say that trans women are not women. I'm also going to say this because I've been feeling the need to say this. I struggle with all this conversation because the same company, Netflix, I'm sure that when they do their hiring and when they do all of their work, they ultimately say, we love and we support LGBTQ people. We want you here, yada, yada, yada. For you as a company to say that you love us and support us, but then you are going to take a platform of someone who is a comedian that is ultimately harming us and aligning yourself with that, that's a problem for me. And I think that that's what the real conversation is, that yes, we can have conversations about what does the comedy look like, but the way it's impacting me as a trans femme person, that's something that I wish that we spend more time talking about, both on a level of comedy, but also at the larger conversation around the corporation as well.
Yeah, Tehran, I want to hear what you have to say about that.
Well, while I appreciate Dr. John Paul's perspective, and respectfully, I have to disagree. Because first of all, if you do not believe in the freedom of speech for those you disdain, you do not believe in the freedom of speech, period. And secondly, And secondly, I would like to say that the concept is we're having the most conversations around transphobia now because of Dave Chappelle than we ever had in the history. So while we're talking about Black trans women being murdered, we should also talk about this conversation that's happening because Dr. John Paul and myself might never ever even have met under normal circumstances. And yet here we are having a conversation because that's what comedy is about. And just because you're offended doesn't mean you're right. On the flip side, just because you're offensive doesn't mean you're right either. In the middle is this gray area, and that gray area is comedy. And it's the responsibility of comedy to push all narratives and all perspectives, because that is what comedians do. That is what comedians do, because comedians are the modern day philosophers. And it's not, the best joke isn't, haha, that's funny. The best joke is, that's so true. And it's just giving voices to people. So now you hear voices, and now we're hearing yours.
Whatever happened to knock knock, who's there? This comedy has really gone beyond comedy. I actually don't consider Dave Chappelle a comedian as much as he used to be. He's more of a philanthropist now, I guess you could say, or an activist, or whatever word you may put on it. He's a motivational speaker or just a speaker, but I sometimes don't find his stand-up funny as I do enlightening or even sometimes offensive. Samson?
All those things, Tammy, are a part of comedy. And, comedy can be church, as it is when you come to one of my comedy shows. Comedy can also be philosophy, motivational speaking, all those things. But at the end of the day, comedy should challenge the way that you think in some kind of way. So to piggyback off of Tehran and all those brilliant points, to answer some of the doctor's very brilliant points as well, I will say that comedy itself and the brilliance of it, of that art form, is why we are here having the conversation. And I think we've achieved a lot by doing that.
Well, I'm going to achieve a lot by going to a commercial break and coming right back to keep talking about comedy. Ain't now one of y'all said nothing funny yet. I'm getting offended. I got comedians on the show and y'all ain't been funny yet. I need some funny up in here. We'll be right back on Business of Being Black with Tammi Mac on Fox Soul. Welcome back to Business of Being Black with Tammi Mac. I'm Tammi Mac, and the business of being Black today is comedy. Is it necessary to censor the art form? Please welcome award-winning comedian Samson McCormick, who has films out that are far from comical, I might add, Samson.
Really? So, okay. I promise there are some funny films, but y'all, I'm a deep brother, but we'll get to that later.
Okay. Hold that thought. I also have comedian and personality Tehran Von Gossery here with us, an educator and culture critic, Dr. Jonathan Paul Higgins. We are talking about comedy, and why not talk about comedy to somebody who is a culture critic and to comedians. So let's take it back from what we were talking about. Is it right for a comedian to perform jokes against a social group or culture that they're not a part of? I love this question because if you're white and you say certain jokes about Black people, you will get creamed. But if you're Black and you say certain jokes about white people or Black people, you're good. It's almost like some people get a pass when telling jokes and others don't. So how do we feel about that? Doctor?
Well, so if you're going to start with me, I always like to say, mind the business that pays you. And I think there's a lot of folks who specifically are not a part of this community or understand or have done the research enough to understand the community that to make comments about it. I would never, this is just personally, me personally, there are a lot of things that I feel like I can say I know because I identify as non-binary and trans femme, but I'm not a trans woman. I'm not a trans Black woman. So there are just things in my opinion that I would leave alone. But I definitely do, I would like to say this. I think the biggest thing for me is that there's a responsibility that comes with, you can tell your jokes, you can get your jokes off, but I also would say I respect the people who I can tell have done the research to make sure that their jokes are pertinent to what they're trying to do in that sense. And I would just ultimately say, I think there is a big responsibility that if you are not a part of a community, that you do have the responsibility to make sure that your jokes align with the group, or make sure that the group that you're representing or you're talking about is there. So that's just my opinion.
Tehran?
Well, with great power comes great responsibility. That argument that Dr. John Paul presented is a very amazing and strong one, except for the fact that not everyone with power has accountability. And when it comes to white culture, we have seen, historically speaking, that has caused a lot of trauma to the Black community. However, I still do not censor white comedians. What I do is not wait for November of every election year to vote. I vote every day with my dollar. And so instead of canceling it for everybody, I simply don't support that comedian. If I don't appreciate what you're doing, I don't support you. And if I don't like something you're saying, I do something that my mom taught me, change the channel. And that is how I solve that problem.
But I think the problem with changing the channel or moving along after witnessing someone that you're not interested in, or that doesn't ring your bell, so to speak. The problem with that is that they have this platform, which Dr. John talked about. They have this platform of millions of people. So it's okay if I don't like Dave Chappelle, if my mama don't like Dave Chappelle, and we change the channel, or we don't watch Netflix. But the problem with that is that he has millions upon millions of people who are never going to change the channel, because that's his fan base. And so if he still continues to spew things that one community feels is not only offensive, but is moving that particular community down a dirt road, is that still okay, Samson?
Yes. I say yes, and I would say why. Okay. So if you come to one of my comedy shows, everybody's at my show. White people come, Black people come, trans people come, little old ladies come with their little Bibles in their hand, and they come ready to throw some anointing oil on my gay ass, and then they fall in love. My comedy is for everybody. And I should have that right. Just like you go to a Dave Chappelle show and he should have that right. And he speaks to his audience. I study comedy, and I think the issue lies more in understanding how comedy works and learning how to meet people where they are so that you can have those conversations, right? Because that's never going to change. People are going to think the way that they think, which is how Dave Chappelle is able to relate to those audiences, and you have to be able to have that conversation. I think personally, as a comedian, you cannot have that conversation unless you are able to take a joke. That's how I grew up. Somebody said something about your mama lopsided titties. You said something about their nappy-headed mama. And that's what happened.
I get that, Samson, but the bottom line is, if it hurts a person, shouldn't it be stopped?
No, because comedy has always been that way.
This is what has created people to want to kill themselves, to feel suicidal. It's that you're on the school bus and you're headed to school, and it's that one comedian in the back that's dissing everybody. And then there's that one sensitive person that really can't take it from a literal sense, mentally cannot cope with being laughed at in a group of people or being talked about when they already have their own insecurities to deal with in the world. And that's the person that ends up either going to grab a gun and shooting the school up, or committing suicide themselves. So it's a fine line we're walking when we talk about talking about people publicly like that, isn't it?
No, I think that strength comes when you are able to get in on the joke and laugh at yourself. When I was growing up and people made fun out of you, that's what you did. And that's where our strength came from. I think that for our community, a huge resolution will lie in supporting comedians who are talking about what you want to talk about. I've been out for 20 years and I'm still waiting for my community to show up for me. Flame Monroe, it's almost like we have to get a stamp from straight people for other gay and trans and lesbian people to say, oh, it's okay to start going to these shows. And I think we need to start supporting people.
I never knew that. I've had you on the show several times. I've never heard that. So that's interesting that you would say that. Tehran.
Because I'll tell you something right now. There was a statement made just last year that offended a lot of people. And it was simply Black Lives Matter. So should we cater to the people that felt like all lives matter? They were very offended. They were very hurt that they felt that their lives didn't matter. Should we cater to that? No, because we're not caterers, we're comedians. So we don't cater to audiences, we comedy for them. And that comedy has power and it has meaning, but not because of the audience, but because of ourselves. And just like a singer goes on stage and there's instruments that play and they make music, we make music as well. That music and that instrument that we play, as Dave Chappelle so eloquently says, is the audience, and their music is laughter. And that is what we do. And whether that's for everybody, that's up to you. But art, much like beauty, is in the eye of the beholder.
Yeah. So if this is the kind of comedy that any comedian started off using, or if this is what they had in mind for their whole comical career, why is it when they get large? And I'm speaking, maybe let's use Kevin Hart for an example. Kevin Hart has been a comedian for a long time, but it wasn't until he got the invitation to host the Oscars that the LGBTQ community pulled back something from 20, 30 years ago and said, ha ha, we got you. You said something bad about us. You can't do the Oscars. And then when he said, okay, I'm cool, I'm not going to do the Oscars, the LGBTQ community got upset with him and was like, oh, you shouldn't have backed down. You should have, so what exactly should a person do, a comedian specifically do under these circumstances, Dr. John Paul?
I just take a number out of the book of Chelsea Handler. I talked about this on several podcasts and different things. There was a time where Chelsea Handler was telling a lot of jokes specifically that hurt Black women. And she ultimately said very publicly on Ellen, I did the research I needed to do. I did what I felt I needed to do to make amends with the harm that I caused to other Black women. And I think that that's ultimately what I feel like, I just want to say this. I've never once, and I think that this is so pivotal to say, I've never once said that I think we should cancel anyone. We shouldn't, the whole conversation around canceling and censorship and all that is very interesting to me. I think the conversation is, I think that there's this level of accountability that comes with what you say. I will be very transparent. I've been fired for a job for speaking up about Black people, LGBT people. I recognize that came with just what happened with me. And I now have a larger platform because of it. But I do recognize that one of the things that I think is so important here is that when you do something that a group of marginalized people feel is wrong, you have to be held accountable to that. And I feel like regardless of what that accountability looks like or how you decide to go down that road, there is still a responsibility that comes, like Taryn said earlier, with great power comes great responsibility. And so a part of that great responsibility is accountability.
Well, I'm going to take accountability for a commercial break right now. We'll be right back on Business of Being Black with Tammi Mac on FOXSOUL. Welcome back to Business of Being Black with Tammi Mac. I'm Tammi Mac. And today, the business of being Black is comedy. Should it be censored? Are comedians going a little overboard with their platforms? We were talking about Kevin Hart and how the LGBTQ plus community shunned him away from hosting the Oscars. And Kevin Hart himself decided, you know what? I ain't trying to do it. It's cool. It's cool. My time will come when it comes. It's not now. So Tehran, what are we feeling about this whole Kevin Hart situation when the LGBTQ community blasted him?
Well, there's a difference between Kevin Hart and Dave Chappelle. And the difference is Kevin Hart, who I adore as a comedian, doesn't have to do Jumanji 14. He doesn't have to be Disney brand Kevin Hart. So when you portray that person, then it's very difficult and you have to walk things back. Now, do I think Kevin Hart should have ever apologized for what he did? If he sincerely felt that he did, yes, but not just to comply and cater to a community. He should do as he personally felt. And in that respect, I really love what Dr. John Paul said about doing the research. And do I feel like Kevin Hart did the research and apologized? I don't know if that was a sincere apology. What I do know is that Kevin Hart, the comedian, isn't going to get canceled. That's a different job. Kevin Hart, the brand, the Disney brand, the ABC family brand, that person has a different whole branding. Nobody's out there trying to cancel Gucci Mane. And that's what I'm afraid of. I'm afraid of that slippery slope. When does enough become enough? When do we stop? Well, we can't listen to rap anymore because that's offensive. And notice, once again, we're going after people of color. No one's going after the comedian Anthony Jeselnik, who says, horrendous things all the time. In fact, that's his mode of comedy. And if you like it, and if you like that baby blender humor, then he's the perfect person. No one's going after Ben Shapiro, who has a huge and large platform and actually says intelligently a lot of very offensive things. And nobody should be trying to cancel Alex Jones. Just find him on his own platform. But when it comes to comedians of color, all of a sudden they're the first ones we point at. We point at comedians like Kevin Hart, he can't do it. But Jon Stewart, despite everything he said, he's perfect. Adam Sandler, everything he said, he's perfect. Cedric Gervais, anything he said, he's perfect as well.
Dr. John Paul, I got to get a response from that one.
Yeah, so I think what you're speaking to, Taryn, is this idea of how I would say masculinity as a whole is protected, and really thinking about too specifically white supremacy, how it's protected in so many different instances. And I think that that's what the larger conversation is. I think the one thing I'm going to continue to keep saying is that no matter how we look at this conversation, white supremacy is impacting us all in one way or another, even if we don't want to admit it. And I think one of the biggest things in this conversation is just that. I think what we're really speaking to is this idea that there are a lot of white comics, specifically white male comics, who get away with saying and doing a lot of things that are wrong. However, I'm going to stay in the lane with James Baldwin and say, I can critique it because I love it. And at the same time, we have to, two things can coexist at the same time. Yes, comedy can be critiqued, but at the same time, we have to have a conversation too about how white supremacy, how racism, how all these other different things move in this world. But what I will say is that I will always stand behind this idea that we have to be mindful that just because we think something is funny or just because we think something is intelligently funny doesn't necessarily mean that it's not harmful. So,
yeah. Samson, let's talk about it. So, white comedians get a pass. I mean, Bill Maher used the N-word and he's still around. So how do we feel about these white comedians getting passes and not being canceled or even considered for cancellation?
That's the way this business works, unfortunately. It's they get to do that. And I think that there is this larger idea around freedom of expression when it comes down to how white men get to talk. And they get to be a lot more critical than a black male comedian ever would. And people accept that. And that shows the double standard that exists very blatantly.
It also shows the racism of America and the privilege of white people. When black people say certain things, they're appalled that we would even say it. I mean, Muhammad Ali is a perfect example of that. The way he spoke, white people were not happy with the way he spoke, with how confident he was about himself, with how blatantly he said things and called truth to power. And there's even video that's gone around about from old classic television shows where Muhammad Ali straight up told a white woman, you don't like that I'm saying it because I'm black, just call it what it is. And a lot of times that happens when black people say things, white people don't like it because how dare you say it, black man, how dare you? Tehran, should black comedians stay away from jokes that punch down on other marginalized groups?
Good comedians should stay away from jokes that punch down marginalized groups. And by punching down, I simply mean low-hanging fruit. It's easy to pick, but it doesn't taste as good as the fruit that's on top of the tree. So go and reach for that higher fruit. And I'm not saying you shouldn't say offensive things. I'm just saying you should say it in a better way. That is all I'm expressing. You should reach higher, and there's better things and more things we can talk about. And that's why comedy has evolved. And with Chappelle, that's what the problem with a lot of comedians is because we're looking at this macro of what it means and not the micro of the cosmos. We're looking at everything he said and what his ultimate point was and not the microaggressions that people are pinpointing. And even in our interpersonal relationships, we get very offended by this. If you've ever been in a relationship and your partner turns to you and says, so basically what you're saying is they're about to misinterpret everything you just said. They're about to misinterpret everything you just said. They're about to say it wrong. And that's what a lot of comedians feel is going on right now.
Yeah. Well, I always feel like because of social media, anything you say will get completely reversed because there are so many eyes that have the opportunity to respond to what you say, which has not always been the case in the past. If I go on social media and say, I love oranges, inevitably there's someone going, well, apples are the better. An apple a day keeps the doctor away, not an orange. So it really doesn't matter what you say these days. Someone is offended by it. So how do we move past a small group of people being offended versus a large group of people being offended by comedy? Samson?
Keep saying what you want to say, so that people can find a way to have the conversations. I think, like I said earlier, the issue now, age of social media, is that most people are seeking validation from outside, which is perpetuated constantly on social media. And so it has impacted people's self-esteem to be able to accept the reality that people are going to think differently than you like for them to think. And, and it's okay for them to do that. You just need to be able to meet them where they are and find a way to have that conversation and respectfully disagree if you need to.
It has to be hard for a comedian today because when I think about our classic veteran comedians, when I think about Joan Rivers, when I think about Andrew Dice Clay, when I think about Dick Gregory, when I think about Paul Mooney and these comedians that really, really crossed the line. I mean, even Richard Pryor on his television sketch show used the N-word on several occasions. You could not dare do that today. So are we moving forward in a comedy world or are we regressing in a comedy world?
We're moving backwards. If you look at history, history recycles itself over and over again. There was a time in history that there was kind of a dark ages where you couldn't joke about things. There were certain things that people just would not support in theater and things like that. We're back there again. If you look at the 1960s, when people like Lenny Bruce were being arrested for standing up on stage doing certain jokes, which was canceling back then, we've arrived back again. But mark my words, in about 10 years, people are going to get tired of this and we're going to be back to, telling it like it is.
Yeah, because I look at All in the Family. I mean, one of the best sitcoms ever created, and particularly the writing on that show and how it touched on racism, sexism, and every other thing that you could imagine America represented in a way that honestly opened up conversation. But the question is, does joking about specific taboo topics, does it open conversation like you suggested earlier, Teron, or does it just make room for the people who believe that to continue to believe that?
I think there's always going to be room for the people who believe that to believe that. Comedy opens conversations. That's what comedy does. If you don't believe me, think about all the times comedy has impacted the way you have thought, whether it's from Chris Rock's Kill the Messenger, which is ironically the best title of all time right now, because that's what we're trying to do is kill all the messengers, or Dave Chappelle or Tiffany Haddish. These conversations really resonate with us, especially in marginalized communities, And comedy has always been a form of freedom of expression and a freedom from oppression for marginalized communities, which is why you see so many Jewish comedians, Black comedians, minority comedians who have found their freedom in that space on stage.
Let's take a little commercial break and come back and see what freedom is really about when we do a lightning round with our panelists on Business of Being Black with Tammi Mac on FOXSOUL. Welcome back to Business of Being Black with Tammi Mac. I'm Tammi Mac. Hello, everybody. Is it necessary to censor the art of comedy? That's what the Business of Being Black is today. Please welcome award-winning comedian Samson McCormick, comedian and personality Teron Von Gossary, and educator and culture critic Dr. Jonathan Paul Higgins. Let's do a lightning round. I love a great debate. Before we end this conversation, it's time for my favorite part of the show, which is something I like to call the lightning round, where I give my guests one last chance to get their points across. Are you ready? And listen, I guess the point would be comedy to censor or not to censor. And let's start off with you, Samson.
You can't censor comedy. If you censor comedy, then it's no longer funny. That point blank. You got to tell the truth.
I'm giving you a point for that one. Tehran?
If you're sensitive, when it drizzles, you'll feel like it's a monsoon. You cannot censor comedy. It's a storm that keeps on coming.
Oh my, okay, you get 2 points for that one. The monsoon? Okay, the monsoon. I knew you went to college. Okay, Dr. John Paul?
The question I'm going to ask is that if you have to laugh at my pain in order for you to find something funny, then it says more about you than it does me.
But Dr. John Paul, Kevin Hart did a whole comedy show titled Laugh at My Pain.
Well, hey, again, if you have to laugh at the idea that I am oppressed, then I don't know. Like I said, it says more about you than it does me.
Tehran, you want to come back on that one?
Well, actually, in this regards, Dr. John Paul has a point because Kevin Hart said, laugh at my pain. He talked about his own pain and not the pain of others. And that's where the difference lies. However, in my estimation, it's not about laughing at each other's pain. It's about understanding each other's hearts. And that's where true comedy lies.
Samson?
I also think, like I said, I'm going to stick to telling the truth. When you go to the family reunion and your aunt come up in there drunk, smoking a cigarette, she's funny because she's going to air out the family secrets, and it's funny because she's telling the truth. Keep telling the truth.
I'm sorry, Samson. It is not funny when your aunt with that cigarette and that mustache come up in the family reunion like, that's not your daddy, huh, boo? That is not funny. It's funny to everybody but me who don't know that that's not my daddy.
Right.
And it's still the truth, but it's still the truth.
Right. It might be the truth, but my question is, why do we keep laughing? Like you said at the top of this, the idea that we're laughing at trauma, we're laughing at the idea that Black trans women are dying. Why is that funny to anybody?
I'm so sorry, Dr. John Paul. Nobody finds that funny, and no one's laughing at that. However, the reason why we laugh is because it keeps us from crying. And that's why we laugh. And I'll tell you something. When you're in a room full of people and they're crying, regardless, the fact that it's a room full of people are crying by themselves. But when you're in a room full of people laughing, they are laughing together. And ultimately speaking, just because you're offended does not mean you're right. And you made a point earlier today where you asked, well, you wouldn't make fun of someone who died or someone's mother who has cancer. And I simply say it depends on who you are. And that's the fact. The same way that everybody wants to be themselves, let everybody be themselves. And better yet, you should never get mad at a bear for being a bear. Just simply don't treat it like a puppy. And what I mean by this is, if we all use the political correct blanket that we have, then we'll never know people's truths. They'll just hide it behind the fact. We see this in white supremacy all the time as the greater example, because it's not the people in the KKK hoodies that we're the most afraid of. It's Karen and Carol who work in human resources who simply do not promote Black people, but say all the right things. That's who I'm most afraid of. I'm afraid of Kevin and Brian, who work at the bank, who say all the right things, but don't give bank loans to Black people either. That's who I'm the most afraid of. And so you should always let people do what they want to do so that you always know what they would rather do.
Oh, that's a great point, Dr. Samson. Go ahead.
Yeah, so that you can meet people where they are. I said this last week. I have cousins who say really homophobic things, but they're not homophobic. They actually like gay people, but I mean, I say this, as a community, if we expect to be equal like everybody else, we need to be able to take the jokes like everybody else do. And when I go to my family reunions, my cousins make fun out of gay people and everything else. And people listening might go, oh, I'm offended, but let somebody mess with you while you're walking down the street. These same dudes who say homophobic things and make transphobic jokes, what are perceived as transphobic jokes, would never let a trans woman get killed. They would never let me get beat up on the street. But that's just a part of humor. It's acknowledging you, but it's also making fun out of you. Loosen up.
Whatever happened to humor as love? Like a lot of times when someone's laughing at you or joking about you or with you, it means that they love you. It means that, they down for you. They riding with you. Has humor now gotten away from that in comedy? Dr. John?
I think people have made it that.
I'm going to say that I hear everything that everyone is saying, but as someone who, like I said, is outrightly trans femme and is outrightly being impacted by all of the things that folks are quote unquote laughing at and even finding humor in, I can't sit here and say like, so I think the biggest thing for me is this. Yes, comedy is funny, but when we start thinking about this idea that so much of the stuff that we've just accepted, oh, it's just a joke. It's just a joke. You know, my uncle used to call me fat and ugly, you know, a lot when I was a child. He's just joking with you, right? And now I spend every 2 weeks in therapy talking to my therapist about why I have body image issues, why I have issues with the way I see myself in this world as a trans femme person, right? It might just be a joke to you, but when it is impacting my livelihood as a person, that is the conversation. And it's not directly, I'm not worried about Dave Chappelle. I'm not worried about Dave Chappelle. I'm worried about the man who just called me the F word at Universal last week with me and my husband. I'm worried about the individual who is now looking at me when I walk into a store and is ultimately pulling or going for their gun because they want to meet me out in the parking lot. I get where comedy is because I come from a long line of people who love to use comedy to get their points across. Yes, some things might be funny, but if your funny is going to get me killed, that is where I stand, and that is the conversation that I'm wanting to have. Why is it that your humor has to be at the expense of my livelihood? That is the question that I'm asking.
Yeah, I don't think anyone thinks that's funny. I would agree with you there. How about this? As society becomes more inclusive, how can comedy be a positive tool for that movement, Dr. Jean Paul?
You know, I think when we talk about inclusion and we talk about how we can use comedy, you know, I think this idea of like speaking truth to power, I think a great conversation. There was something I saw with Cat Williams and he was talking about the ways, what it means to be a good comic, right? And I loved kind of some of the points that he was putting out there. And while I can't recall every single point, I think a big part of this conversation is, yes, we can talk about what is truly happening, right? We can talk about racism. We can talk about homophobia. We can talk about transphobia. But I think a good part of being a comic is, like I said, doing the research to make sure that whatever jokes you're going to tell is a joke that's genuinely speaking to the issue that's at hand. Not making fun of people, but speaking to the issue that's at hand. So like I said, with Dave Chappelle, his conversation was not about the issues that trans women face or the issues that trans Black women are dealing with. His conversation was, I don't believe trans women are women. That's the problem, right?
I have to disagree with you there. I think his conversation really was about how disproportionately the transgender community is when it comes to being offended while Black. I don't know exactly how to say it, but I didn't quite understand why so many people took it that he was going at the transgender community when really what he was doing was saying, you guys have one rule for transgender, but then another rule for Black people. And so I think he was speaking more on the Black people's side than the transgender, because let's face it, he doesn't know anything about that.
Right, but we also have a conversation about the ways that we separate Blackness from being queer. And I think that's the conversation. When intersectionality is a whole entire ideology and thought that no one seems to want to have conversations about, that's where I struggle when we're not talking about intersectionalities, the oppression that both Black and trans people face.
And that's what I thought Dave Chappelle was talking about. That's exactly what he was talking about. But I think so many people were so busy getting offended that they didn't hear it. But that's exactly what he was talking about, the intersectionality of the two.
Right, but he named himself as a TERF. So when you say that you are a TERF and that you don't believe trans women are trans women, that is the problem, right? You can't say that you believe in intersectionality and then name yourself as a TERF. It's not possible.
Okay, I can't speak to that. But we're going to take a quick break, come right back on The Business of Being Black with Tammi Mac on FOXSOUL. Welcome back to Business of Being Black. And the business of being Black today is comedy. Should it be censored? Should comedians sit down and pontificate on world matters and write in a way that is appeasing to most communities as opposed to offensive to most communities? We were talking about Dave Chappelle and him utilizing the word TERF in his comedy special, The Closer. I actually didn't believe that he was was coming against the transgender community, but I'm not transgender. So I absolutely positively cannot say how you should or should not feel. But I do believe that in the sarcasm that is Dave Chappelle, oftentimes comedy is subjective. And people can miss the sarcasm in any joke. I see it on The View all of the time when Whoopi Goldberg or Joy Behar is speaking something comically or being sarcastic, and they get floods of letters because someone took it the wrong way. A person can actually say something and not mean it how you took it. And it's very difficult, whether you're a comedian or a talk show host like myself, it's very difficult for people to see your intentions behind something, but it's also difficult when you're speaking to someone or you're speaking to millions of people to be in particularly careful about what somebody else might think about what you said. That's a dangerous place to have to be when you're speaking publicly on a regular basis, Tehran.
Communication is not easy. And for me to express exactly how I feel to someone else is an actual skill set, so much so that we have mythological stories about things such as the Blarney Stone, which allows you the ability to communicate as effectively as possible. We give statues to people who are able to persuade with their words. What's in a word? Everything. And so that's why it's so important. We always say, like, a picture's worth 1,000 words, but the perfect word is worth 1,000 pictures. And that is what storytellers and comedians who are the modern day philosophers do. We speak in terms that are oftentimes highbrow. And in that highbrow, we use sardonic and sarcastic terminology. When Dave Chappelle refers to TERF, and TERF, of course, meaning trans exclusionary radical feminist, basically a feminist who excludes transgender women from the advocacy of all women's rights. And the reason I know this, Dr. John Paul, is because I did the research, as most good comedians would do. It's in a sarcastic manner. It's in a manner which is meant to be sardonic and absurd, because comedians speak in exaggeration and absurdity. We are often improper and inappropriate, and which is what we do the best. It is literally our functionality. It is our purpose. And so that's the reason we bring out things. You know how many people like myself went and researched TERF because Dave Chappelle used it? That's the place of power. That's using great power for responsibility, because people were actually learning. And if you want to say that more people, no, any person reasonable did not wake up hating trans people after Dave Chappelle's The Closer. A reasonable person actually felt an affinity towards trans people and these conversations that we're having, which I've heard in record numbers from everywhere from the nightclub to the comedy club.
To the barbershop, to the beauty shop. The word TERF has come up because nobody knew what that was, including me before. And I consider myself an ally, but including me before that special, I was like, TERF? I didn't even know that there existed feminists who, I didn't know that the word existed. Obviously, I know that there are women who believe that if you weren't born a woman, that you are not a woman. I obviously believe that, but I didn't know that there was an actual acronym for the term. Samson?
I didn't know that either, and so, like, Tehran said, like, I went and I did the research. And so now it's something else that we're knowledgeable on and are able to have a conversation about, because what? A comedian talked about it.
Yeah. And Samson, you've been doing this work for quite some time.
I've been doing it a long time, Tammy. I've been
20 years.
For 20 years. And, it as a very openly gay comedian, when that wasn't in the comedy landscape like that, especially as a Black man, it took a lot of work. And so now we have, trans comedians and non-binary comedians. And I'm just asking the community to support that. It really helps us to be able to do what we do, to get booked, to be seen, when the bookers and the business knows that there's an audience who wants to hear what we have to say.
Absolutely. Please tell us where we can find your project, Love the One You're With and B-Boy Blues.
On my OnlyFans, and I'm just playing. So if you follow me on Instagram at Samson McCormick, the information is there. Also, Amazon Prime is where Love the One You're With is. B-Boy Blues will be out soon.
You're making beautiful music with your movies, Samson, I have to say. Tehran, any upcoming projects you got? Yes, of course.
I'm at the Laugh Factory every Thursday, 9:30 p.m., speaking my truth. So please come and find me. And I'll tell you something, Samson. It's not just members of your community, that it should be all communities. Everybody should be coming to comedy clubs to listen to everybody's perspective. Mm-hmm. That's how comedy works best. And so all audiences should be supporting you, because every show's a bringer show. The difference is I bring 200 and Kevin Hart brings 200,000. Once I bring 200,000, I'm Kevin Hart. I'm Dave Chappelle. And that's where hopefully I'll meet you at the top.
Oh, you will.
See, I consider y'all already at the top, but who am I? Who am I? I get what you're saying. All right, Dr. John Paul, you have educated us today. So tell us more about your educational work, please.
Yeah, so currently I am a educator at the University of Redlands, and I do a lot of work around social justice and education and teaching. But I also do stuff in the media world as well. So you can find me. I've worked with Ebony. I've written for BET, The Root. So you can basically find many of my various articles where I'm talking about intersectionality and the experiences of Black queer people on those sites as well.
I do want to learn more about intersectionality, because I think it's very important that we all come to an agreement where our rights and privileges and equality are won in a real way. So I can't wait to work with you someday on that. I want to thank Tehran and also Dr. John Paul and Samson for hanging out with me on Business of Being Black today. And I want to thank you, soulmates, for watching us. Stay tuned for TGIF. Of course, Claudia Jordan heading that up. And until tomorrow, everybody, it's a blessing to be in your box. Bye now.